G'day everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today's video is for anyone who has swelling, anyone who's dealing with swelling, they can't get rid of their swelling, or they want their swelling to go away as quickly as possible. It's for anyone who has acute swelling, so say you've just hurt yourself, you were fine, you've injured yourself, now there's some swelling there that you want to go away as fast as possible. But the video is also for those people who have chronic swelling, swelling that's been hanging around for a long time. Maybe it's a symptom of an underlying instability or some underlying wear and tear, arthritis, maybe an old injury that hasn't been healing very well. This video is also for you. So anyone who has any swelling related to musculoskeletal issues, hopefully these tips are going to help you get through that a lot faster than you would otherwise do. I think there's four things that I think that we'll go through, 4 tips to really help expedite that removal of swelling. In isolation, each one of these 4 options is pretty good on its own, but it becomes really powerful when you start stacking them one on top of each other. So if you can hang around to the end of the video, hopefully you'll come away with all 4 of those ideas that will really help you get through this as quickly as possible. So we'll get towards that in a minute, but I think the best place to start with this is to talk about what you shouldn't be doing for your swelling. I think clinically we see a lot of people come in that carry with them maybe some outdated advice, some ideas that potentially aren't as useful as we once thought they were. So we'll just touch on that quickly. I think it's really important to sort of talk about that first and then sort of usurp that or replace that with better options, things that work really well and really quickly that can give you some reward for all your hard effort. So before we get to that, let me know in the comments below, what are you dealing with at the moment? What's caused your swelling? Is it an injury? Is it a chronic issue? Just so we know what types of people are, are watching these videos, what you're dealing with at the moment. If you go on to enjoy the video, please consider leaving a like below and also subscribing if you're new. It really helps these videos get out to more people, which obviously is the ultimate goal. We want to make sure that the information out there is as relevant and effective as possible. And obviously doing that can really help support us at the same time. So getting into it, the number one thing that you should really avoid doing if you have swelling, and this can seem controversial to a lot of people, but when you sort of take a step back and think about it, match up the theory with the application and the results, it becomes less controversial, more sort of matter of fact. And I'm always a little bit reticent to say this, but the one thing that you should avoid doing if you have swelling is the traditional RICE protocol. Now, that can often sound a bit strange, and again, let me know how you feel about this in the comments below, but for a long time, we've talked about RICE in terms of rest, ice, compression, and elevation as the things that you need to do to help recover from an injury as quickly as possible. Now, we've done a video on this before, we've put out some information on this before, which I'll put in the description, or I'll link up here, whichever one's easiest to do. That sort of goes into detail about why sort of rest, ice, compression, and elevation aren't necessarily the things we need to keep working on. But for swelling specifically, rest, ice, compression, and elevation potentially doesn't assist the body to facilitate the removal of that swelling as quickly as possible. It's potentially actually a handbrake to that happening. It's kind of like putting pause on the normal physiological functions that happen to produce swelling and to remove swelling. And ultimately it can slow down your recovery, which is often news to a lot of people because the sole reason why we do these things, we've used that protocol for so long, is to speed up and optimize that recovery process. So again, I won't go into too much detail about the why. I'll let you look into that yourself. The video will go for too long if we do that. But the broader understanding is that maybe it doesn't do what we think it does. We want to sort of respect what the body's trying to do, and those things don't necessarily do that. So if you can sort of use ice, rest, compression, and elevation, put that aside for a second. We want to tap into the things that the body needs to happen in order to get rid of swelling. And in order to understand what swelling is, we just need to quickly touch on what it is and in order to get to how to expedite its removal. So I guess the common misconception with swelling is that it's bad, is that it's an unwanted thing. And I think the misconception to clear up about swelling is it's not necessarily good or bad conceptually. It's just a thing. It's just the accumulation of waste at the end of the inflammatory cycle. So once your body's come in, blood's got to the area, all your inflammatory markers, all your immune system, everything's working together to kickstart that process, that healing process. The byproduct of all of that is swelling. And one of the things that a lot of people forget about swelling is that the only way that your body can remove swelling is via the lymphatic system, which is basically a passive, it's like an alternative set of veins. It's a passive system that requires muscle activation and movements to flush things out, to pull it out and to pump it out of the area. So sort of turning back around to the rest, ice, compression, elevation thing quickly, resting and compressing potentially stop the ability for your body to remove swelling. Rest obviously doesn't engage your muscles, it doesn't move the waste away. Compression can trap the waste in the area by basically creating a tourniquet. So one of the things we want to do, and this is the first, it sort of flows into the first step, the first tip that I want you guys to think about if you have swelling. The first thing is movement. We want to encourage as much pain-free movement, as much dysfunction-free movement as possible. So we'll talk about this in terms of maybe a knee injury, because there's a lot of people with sore knees at the moment, whether it's chronic arthritis, just general aches and pains, sports injuries, whatever it might be. We'll talk about it in the context of a knee. So if you have an acute knee injury and it's swollen up, you may not necessarily be able to move around in the traditional sense where you can walk around and do things, but you need to try and engage the muscles around that as much as possible, as often as possible, to help flush out that sort of swelling as it accumulates. Because what we find is the accumulation of swelling, so when something swells up, it's not necessarily because something bad is happening, it's because we're failing to remove that swelling fast enough, so it starts to accumulate. And I know there's people out there who've sprained their ankle before, it's blown up, they've done what they've thought was the best thing, they've rested it, they've iced it, they've compressed it, they've elevated it, and that foot's really swollen up. And the reason why that swells up, because we're not sort of moving it and using the tissue and flushing out that swelling. But one of the problems with swelling hanging around, and why we need to get rid of it as quickly as possible, is that it can start to create atrophy in the muscles around it, because the presence of swelling is a signal to your body that there's dysfunction. So the muscles can start to atrophy and weaken. It's something you have to tack on to the end of your rehab once you're through this inflammatory phase. They can take extra time to get that musculature back to full function. But the second thing that swelling does is it can create pain. So that compression of painful tissue, injured tissue, can increase the amount of pain that you have. So it's really beneficial to get rid of that swelling, to help it flush out that swelling as quickly as possible, to help pain, which again feeds back into your ability to move more. So again, if you can put weight through it, we want you to find whatever your pain-free or relatively pain-free window of movement is. So if you've hurt your knee and you can just gingerly walk around without limping too much, because that can create its own set of problems, then there's a really effective way to help the body sort of re-establish some normality, flush out that swelling, and sort of kickstart that healing process or the recovery process that comes after that. If you can't put weight through the area, you need to figure out a way to still find some movement. So if that's something as simple as sitting there, sort of tensing your calf muscle, tensing your quads, wiggling your foot around, getting some sort of muscle activation in the area, we need you to obsess over that to allow that tissue to consistently pump out that waste so it doesn't start to swell up too much. And as we said before, a surefire sign that you're not doing enough movement is if you see the swelling is increasing. If it's not decreasing, it's getting bigger over a number of days, then you're not encouraging enough movement in that tissue, enough pain-free, respectful movement that doesn't go overboard and create more pain and dysfunction. There'll be a window that you can move something somehow, somewhere, that'll start that process sort of reducing. That's number one. Movement respects the physiology, the physiological processes that need to happen for these things to get better. So movement's number one. Second thing is very, very obvious, very, very simple. It's massage. So it's another M word, movement massage. There's another one coming after this. So massage is an obvious one. It's a fantastic way to help flush out some of that dysfunction. So the advice I want to give in terms of massage and acute injury specifically is you need to make sure that you're not doing a really deep sports massage through an injured area. It doesn't make sense. You can only potentially make matters worse if you're increasing the damage of the tissue, making it bleed more blood flow, all that sort of stuff. What we actually want to do is we want to promote more of a surface level, superficial massage that's more of a milking type massage. So if you just say, I hurt my forearm, we're not trying to get in there and break anything up and really free up some, some stiffness or tightness. There's time for that later on. What we want to do basically is more of a gentle, superficial massage. We're trying to milk that swelling up towards the central areas, towards those lymph nodes, back towards the heart area, again, to sort of encourage that motion. So what you'll find after a really healthy, softer, superficial massage is you might have obviously less swelling, which is the whole goal of this video, but there should be less pain and more comfort moving. So whether that's you trying to massage things yourself, so if you have a sore knee, whether you're really trying to get in there and milking that sort of fluid, that swelling back up towards the central aspects of your body, or you trust someone enough to do that for you, 10 or 15 minutes of that can be a hugely rewarding experience. It can really make a lot of difference in a short amount of time. So movement's number one. We have to have movement at all times in whatever window that's comfortable for you. Massage, again, respectful, pain-free massage that respects how you feel, but also tries to help flush out as much of that passive waste as possible. The third thing is often sort of missed a fair bit, and that's mechanics. So for a lot of people, if you acutely injure yourself, so you twist your knee or you cop a knock and you injure something like your knee, we often forget that the knee may not have been perfect mechanically going into that. So if you were to go through some basic stretching routines, and again, in the context of a sore knee, you might find that a lot of people have generally tight calves, maybe tight hamstrings, tight quads. Most people have ankle stiffness, hip restrictions, lower back stiffness. And what you can do is if you take something as simple as a lacrosse ball, tennis ball, or a foam roller, anything that you can sort of gently place into the tissue around the injured area or around the area that's swollen, the more freedom, the more restriction you can remove from those areas. It feeds a lot of slack into the knee in this example, into the injured area, and improves the way that it's loaded up. So for example, if you have maybe a quadricep muscle that you've torn, and the quad itself is already very tight, your hip flexors are really tight, your hamstrings are already really tight, before you even hurt yourself, then you've got this extra tension in the area that can sort of compromise the healing of the injured site. So if you can imagine that everything's normal and there's a bit of a tear there, the body can sort of, it's left to its own devices a lot more. But if there's already some passive tension in the system, then potentially there's extra scope for more dysfunction, more swelling, and more prolonged dysfunction, because the mechanics of the area are already a handbrake to normal function and normal healing and normal recovery. So getting a ball or a roller, massage can play this role as well, where you, as I said, you don't want to massage directly onto the injured spot. It's counterproductive. But again, everything around that is fair game. So again, if you've hurt your knee, look at the tissue directly above and below, look at the joints above and below, and make sure that you're freeing up some of those mechanical compromises and compensations that may already have been there, so that you can feed some slack into it and restore as much normal function to that area as possible. And what you'll have is more of an indirect benefit in terms of swelling, where not only will you encourage better movement, but it'll make the area less threatened and will have the potential to cause less swelling and sort of perpetuate less swelling as you go along. So it's a really finicky one. It's a little bit of an interesting idea, but clinically I find it works really well in terms of just trying to normalize everything around it to allow the body just to optimize what it's trying to do. So the first one was movements, the second one was massage, and the third one is mechanics, better mechanics. So the fourth one doesn't have an M to it, so I put it at the end, but this one's more of a niche treatment option. Now, I sort of want to make something very clear here. So it's Voodoo Floss. Now, if you haven't heard of Voodoo Floss, if you don't know what it is, it's amazing. I highly recommend that it makes its way into everyone's kit bag of all their mobility devices, all their bits and pieces that you use to service your body regularly, hopefully. It deserves to be in everyone's household. So I'll leave a link in the description so you can at least have a look at what it is and where you can get it from. But if you don't have Voodoo Floss, it's just an elastic, a strong elastic band, a very strong elastic band. You can still use things like TheraBand, not TheraTubing, but TheraBand. You can also use the inner tube of a bike tire as a replacement for this, so you don't have to go out and buy something if you have something already there. But you want this strong elastic compression because it does wonders for short-term flushing out of swelling. Now, the thing that I wanted to make very clear here is this is a separate concept to standard compression. So going back to the rest ice compression model that we've spoken about before that may not be useful anymore in this instance, it's a different way, it's a different form of compression. So the compression that we've always promoted for injury rehab is like a compression sleeve or a bandage that you wrap up and stay there. And the problem with that, as I said briefly before, is it can act like a bit of a tourniquet or a tourniquet, where it doesn't promote easy removal and sort of blood flow to get into the area and waste to get out of the area. It sort of cordons off the area to a lot of normal processes that happen. So there's a lot of evidence, obviously, that suggests that it helps sort of manage things okay. But if you're trying to get from A to B really quickly, you can get by with these other sort of 4 things as opposed to compression. Now, the difference here is that this compression is a very short-term application. So we're talking 1 or 2 minutes. Again, we've sort of spoken about this a little bit in the past. So if you can find the videos for that, you'll be able to see what this is in real time. Again, I'll link to it if I can find it. But the main thing that I think with this is you want to wrap up your injured area or your chronically swollen area very, very tightly. And you want to respectfully and in a very short-term application, as I said, 1 to 2 minutes at most, respecting what your pain level is. So this may not necessarily be for those who have just hurt their body in some way. It might be maybe 2 or 3 days afterwards once the pain settled a little bit and you're just left with a bit of swelling, if that's you. But you can play around with this in terms of how strong and how heavy you do it. If it is more of a structural issue, so say if you've hurt your knee joint, if there's a meniscal issue, maybe some ACL stuff, some of your ligaments, maybe it's the ankle joint, you sprained your ankle. This is potentially a better thing to do than maybe a soft tissue injury. Sometimes those soft tissue injuries can be a bit raw and maybe don't enjoy the shearing effect that happens with this. And because it's probably going to be more, you can sort of protect the injury a little bit more with it if it's a joint injury with this, because it's often less superficial than maybe a soft tissue injury. But again, it's all based on how you feel. If you can do this and you do it and it feels fantastic and makes a strong positive impact, then obviously keep going. If you do it and it feels shocking and terrible, then obviously reconsider how you're doing it first. And if you don't feel like it's appropriate, then obviously put it aside and come back to it again when you feel it is more appropriate. But again, without going into too much detail with this, essentially all you would do is that you want to wrap it up as tightly as possible. So you want to maybe, what I normally tell my patients is maybe loop it over maybe a half width. And you want a decent amount of tension, not full tension, not sort of soft so it sort of can slide around, maybe sort of half tension. And you just want to cover the area as much as possible. Now, the reason why this is only short term, the reason why we only want to do this for a short amount of time is that you're clearly restricting blood flow when you're doing this. There's going to be a tourniquet effect that happens here, as there does with other types of compression. This is actually a more severe version of it, but the difference is because it's only short term and because we're actually going to promote movement. So if you have an injury or some issues that you want to clear up, if you work within your normal range of motion or your pain-free range of motion, the range of motion that your body allows you to work in, the reason why it's called Voodoo Floss is once you've done this for a minute or two and you take it straight off, it's normal for it to look a little bit whiter because the blood's been sort of dispersed away from the area. But then you should find that the blood then comes back into the area again relatively quickly. So if you're doing it on your ankle and you feel like your toes go numb or something, then obviously take it off, respect what's going on. But if you can get away with doing it, it's revolutionized how I treat a lot of injuries in the acute setting and how quickly you can get a lot of the swelling and the dysfunction under control. So if you're someone who has chronic swelling, this is potentially the thing that you have to try above all else if you're looking for something that you can use to control what's going on. So its ability to make inroads by shearing away and flushing out a lot of the swelling is second to none in terms of things that I've seen. In terms of gimmicky sort of things, if you want to call it that, or tools that you can use, it's fantastic. So highly consider that or something like that. And just in terms of an honorable mention, there's a lot of pneumatic compression devices, a lot of passive stimulation, muscular stimulation, whether it's the Mark Pro, Normatec, a whole bunch of other things that they're more passive instruments that you put on your body, and it either creates a muscle activation in terms of the Mark Pro, or if you're looking at Normatec, which is more of like a pressure wave. So you get, I don't do it with my hands here, but say for the boot, for example, you get a lot of pressure in the foot, a lot of pressure in the shin and through the knee, and it's like a wave of pressure that helps flush out what's going on. And the reason why things like the Mark Pro and Normatec are fantastic is because they tap into what the body's trying to do, that passive removal of that swelling via muscle activation. The Normatec tries to mimic that by doing those sorts of things with pressure, whereas the Mark Pro tends to do that by stimulating your muscles to do that. And they're both great because in times where you find movement hard, so say if you're a busy person or you're at work all day and you've got an injury that's swollen, sometimes it's impractical for you to keep moving and doing things specifically to that area while you're trying to do other things that are potentially more important in the moment. So to have a device like the Mark Pro or Normatec to help facilitate that while you're doing something else can really turn things around really quickly. So I think those 4/5 things I think are really important things to consider if you're looking to improve your swelling quickly and effectively. They're the only 4 or 5 things I wanted to mention because they're the things that I feel work fantastically well. And I'd be really disappointed if you didn't get the same results that myself and my patients get with these things. So please consider those 5 options, those 4 options, plus the devices if you're into that sort of thing. And just as a reference point, I think, just to finish up on this video, I think one of the things that we've set really low with swelling and recovery in this instance, we've set the bar really low and our expectations really low in terms of how long you should expect that to hang around for. So if you have an acute injury, if you're not ahead of your swelling within the first 1 to 2 days, you're potentially missing out. Now that may sound unrealistic for a lot of people who have swelling for a week, if not longer. But the ideas that I want to get across here is that potentially those people whose swelling is prolonged and drawn out, you're not necessarily tapping into the body's natural mechanisms. If you're someone who ices religiously, you're trying to do the right thing because that's what you've been told to do, that's what you've known to do forever, then you might actually be slowing it down when what we find now is if we put the old school things aside, come back to some of the things that work really well, you shouldn't have to guess, you shouldn't have to take my word for it. You should just see that things start to move along a lot faster. So again, we're talking 1 or 2 days, aim high. We can get on top of these things a lot faster these days than we used to. So consider those options and let us know how you go. Tell us in the comments below. Let us know whether this resonated with you, whether you found it useful, and obviously like and subscribe if you're new, just to help support the video and the channel. So I hope that was really helpful. I hope it helps you guys get from point A to point B. If you've got your chronic swelling, then obviously your goals are going to be slightly different in terms of what you're focusing on more. You might have to focus more on the mechanical side of things to take away the need for that chronic swelling to consistently be there. You might find that you can get into things a lot harder and you can push the boundaries a lot more if you've got chronic swelling because you're not necessarily at risk of making the initial injury worse. So obviously there's a little bit of nuance in there. Speak to someone if you need to figure that out for yourselves. If not, talk to me. Let me know in the comments. We can sort of get in touch and talk through these sorts of things at the same time. So this has gone on for long enough. I appreciate you watching. Hopefully you've watched all the way through and hopefully it was really useful. But until next time, we'll see you then.